Hi, this is Emily Pritt, and we have our new Taproot podcast that we're bringing to you every week. And today I've got somebody with me. We're going to talk about some psychosocial hazards and kind of dive in a little bit more from the last time we spoke about the psychosocial hazards earlier in the month. So, hello.
Hello. I'm Barb Carr, and I'm the editorial director here at Taproot.
Awesome. So, for those that didn't get to see last time, we were talking about psychosocial hazards. We identified what those are and some things to listen out for at work that you might hear somebody say when they're experiencing psychosocial hazards. And you identified 3. Would you mind to briefly just let our audience know what psychosocial hazards are, and then recap of those 3 real quick?
Yeah. Today I think we can focus in on something that's become very relevant in the past few years, and that is the way that we improve performance at our facilities. So the old way of thinking is to become better at managing people more, and while being a good manager is important, we also want to create workplaces that people want to be in, where people want to come to work every day. So one way that we can do that is by taking a look at any psychosocial hazards that might be present. Mm-hmm. So we did talk about some in a prior video where we talked about the low control an employee might feel that they have over their job. So it's very important that we have our employees feel free to give their input on a job, on how to do a job better. Mm-hmm. So one of the psychosocial hazards was low job control. Another one that we talked about were work-life balance issues that can cause a lot of stress, and that's what psychosocial hazards do. They cause a lot of stress. Mm-hmm. So we want to mitigate that. And the other one that we talked about was the lack of role clarity, people not really knowing what they're accountable for. So when employees don't know what they're supposed to be doing, that can cause a lot of stress too. So all of those hazards fall under kind of work design. There's 3 different types of categories of hazards that we're going to talk about today. But I also want to talk about how the Taproot tools can help you in identifying psychosocial hazards. So when you're thinking about what a psychosocial hazard is, because we're all very familiar with physical hazards like chemical and electrical, or slip and fall, trip and fall hazards, gravity and motion hazards, things like that. They're not so easily identifiable because they pertain to emotional, mental, and social challenges that we all have when we go into the workplace. And every workplace has psychosocial hazards. You can't get around them. They're present everywhere. But just in true Taproot style, we don't want to go willy-nilly just going and randomly picking what we think is a psychosocial hazard to fix and work on. But we want to take a look at them and see, okay, what is the risk of this hazard being present, or what is the consequence of this hazard? How bad is it going to be if we just let this hazard run rampant? Mm-hmm. Those are the things that we want to prioritize when we're fixing psychosocial hazards. That's a little bit about what they are and what we've covered so far.
Yes, absolutely. And we encourage you to go back and watch that initial video that we did. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit too about you said stress. A lot of people will kind of get those 2 mixed up, but you said specifically that stress is a byproduct of psychosocial hazard. That is a mouthful. I'm gonna get tongue tied already trying to say this. But stress is a byproduct of it, and so that's interesting. Like that interesting take, because as what we've been talking about this kind of off to the side, it is still relatively new. ISO it's from 2021. It was the first edition. So you've got a lot of insight to this. And I see one of our first notes up here. It says, stop managing. And I'm just going to let you take the floor and tell me what on earth you're talking about. So let's jump in.
Yeah. And I had mentioned this just a little bit, that we really focus in on managing people and blaming workers if they don't do what we are trying to get them to do, but instead we want to create environments that people want to work in. Mm-hmm. So the Taproot system, we don't want to blame the worker. We want to figure out And if you have attended a Taproot class in the past, you know that you want to figure out what hazards are present, what safeguards are present, are there any safeguards present, and if there are safeguards present, are they working, or do we need to add more safeguards so that it doesn't hit our target? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the same concept with a psychosocial hazard. We don't want to blame our workers for being stressed, for making mistakes because they're stressed about something. We want to take the blame out and really look at what the hazards are. How can we mitigate or eliminate the hazards? So as I mentioned, you can't get rid of a lot of the psychosocial hazards. They're going to be present, but there are things that you can do to mitigate them. Mm-hmm. And even if you identify a psychosocial hazard, it doesn't mean that it even needs to be mitigated. Sometimes you have to really take a look at your workforce mm-hmm. and look at the workers. For example, micromanaging, you can consider that a psychosocial hazard. If you have a boss that's on your back and that's constantly looking over your shoulder, that would cause a lot of stress for some people. Mm-hmm. But other workers invite micromanaging. They like to have a very clear schedule of what they're doing that day. They like to have that person to go back to and tell them what's the next thing to do.
That's a good point.
So you can't make an assumption that just because something that you feel is a hazard to everyone.
That's a great point, because I think a lot of times people who are unfamiliar, it can be kind of a buzzword or word of the moment. They may think, oh, this is just emotional stuff. This is that touchy-feely, or, somebody needs to just, man up, cowboy up, deal with the job. But it's more than that.
Right.
Yeah, I like that. Because you mentioned that, at the beginning we were talking about hazards. There's those hazards we can see, the physical, the slips, the trips, the falls, but on the other side, these hazards still can cause injury. Mm-hmm. And not just a cognitive injury, but because of the stress, we'll just use that word, that it causes, we're distracted or we're not doing things, and so a lot of things can be amiss. Emotional, mental, and social challenges is next. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a good point to then explain a little bit more about how that all works, how that intertwines.
Yeah. Well, safety professionals, we're all familiar with the hierarchy of controls and how we control the physical hazards. So the psychosocial hazards don't fit under the hierarchy of controls as easily, mm-hmm. but you will find that they do fit under engineering and administrative controls. So when you're trying to control a psychosocial hazard, for example, administrative controls are creating policies and procedures for people so that they're not under so much stress on the job, or it would fall under engineering. And you see like tools like the root cause tree can help you identify some psychosocial hazards, because when we're talking about engineering, which is a basic cost category on the root cause tree, there's a lot of things to consider there, like human-machine interface, mm-hmm. right? There's a lot of physical hazards that would fall under that, like the labels need improvement, or the displays need improvement, or the person was, monitoring too many controls. Mm-hmm. So all of these physical hazards can cause emotional and mental stress too. So sometimes the physical hazards are very closely related to the psychosocial hazards. Mm-hmm. And the root cause tree can help you determine maybe some of the root causes that are driving these psychosocial hazards. For example, in work environment, if I'm in a really messy work environment, and you can see on the root cause tree, there's a lot of root causes listed in a work environment, like the housekeeping needs improvement, it's too hot or it's too cold, excuse me, it's too wet or it's too slick. These are very, physical things, but those types of environments cause a lot of stress too. Mm-hmm. So one way that you can identify some psychosocial hazards is by considering your root cause tree and taking a look at the root causes, because that can help you see they're all very closely related, sometimes to physical hazards, but they can help you identify the psychosocial hazards as well. So that's one thing. Thinking about the hierarchy of controls, that they'll fall a lot of times under administrative controls or engineering controls, and using the root cause tree, which is a very detailed tool that you really shouldn't be using unless you're Taproot trained, but we have 2-day and 5-day classes where you can get Taproot trained. It's very systematic. We want to go about it, again, when we're identifying hazards, in a very systematic way and figure out, do these hazards really exist, and are they really affecting our employees the way that we think they are?
Well, what I want to talk about next is, you did mention there were 3 categories of hazards, and that last time we spoke about work design and looked at some of those.
So the work design, the hazards that we've mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, like lack of role clarity, low job control, work-life balance, or even unachievable job demands, those would fall under work design, and that's one category of hazards. There's really 3 categories of hazards specified by ISO 45003, which is the standard that you mentioned during the podcast. It's the voluntary standard for a psychologically safe workplace. So it's voluntary, and the U.S. Does not have so many policies and regulations around it as other parts of the world, like European countries or Nordic countries, Canada. They're a lot more active in training people and identifying these and having rules and regulations that are around psychosocial hazards. So according to the standard, there's the 3 categories of hazards, and that's work design, which we've already covered. There's also psychosocial hazards, which would be like bullying, harassment, lack of support from management, or just poor relations with your coworkers.
That sounds like the HR department right there.
It does. And that is a very good thing that you brought up, because before this ISO 45003 standard came out, those types of things fell under HR. But after the standard came out, it was meant to be used in conjunction with 45001, which is the OHS management system standard. So it's meant to be used in conjunction with that. And the big change to that is now those things are no longer just all HR, but they're shared with safety professionals. So now the safety professionals are involved in identifying not just HR, but working in conjunction with HR to do that. So that's one good thing that kind of came out of
I didn't realize that. That's good, because it's the whole adage about safety first, and like we're all responsible. If we see something, say something, and if there was anything here that we could slip or trip or fall on, we all have that same responsibility. I wouldn't go, well, I'm not in safety. I'm like, no, that's a hazard. I need to do something about it.
Exactly.
So
that's exactly
that shared responsibility, I love that. And I feel like, especially on the American side of things, sometimes we are behind on what the European standards and all that kind of stuff is. So again, this is still relatively new in the policies and things that are coming out, but the it's always been here. We just haven't had the structure and the things to kind of really know how to navigate it. So looping in the safety side of stuff and not just rushing, oh, that's not my department, that's HR. I love it.
This is one reason that you should get your HR people Taproot trained. A lot of people don't consider Taproot root cause analysis something that they would send their HR representatives to, that training. But when you're thinking about psychosocial hazards, it'd be very beneficial to them. And of course, safety professionals are familiar with hazards and targets and building in safeguards. HR professionals have their own, expertise, and it's not usually that. But in a Taproot class, they would learn a lot about that, which would help them when they're identifying these hazards like bullying, harassment, lack of supervisory support, poor coworker relations, and trying to manage those things and make a better working environment that people want to work in. The third category of hazards, according to the standard, is environment, which we've touched on already, and this has to do with physical environment and the quality of the equipment that the worker is using, because those things, as I mentioned, could cause a lot of stress. A physical environment that has too much stuff laying around, a hazardous environment that they're working in, if it's too hot, too cold, they're trying to get their work done, and they're stressed out, they're trying to get out there as fast as possible. All of those things could lend to stress. And we know that when people are stressed, they don't perform well. They're not performing at their best, and we, instead of blaming the worker for not performing well, we want to figure out what hazards are present, how can we mitigate these hazards so that we can have a more productive workplace.
Right. And is to best of the ability of the environment that worker's in. So as companies, organizations, kind of looking at that, because if we want to create a safe environment physically, we should also create a safe environment mentally, socially, and all those other things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about Taproot being a system, and you want to be systematic about identifying psychosocial hazards and really figuring out, not just going in there and just thinking of a bunch of hazards that might be present, but is this really relevant to my workforce or to the workers that are doing this task? There's so much to think about. But I want to talk a minute about, again, how to identify psychosocial hazards. We're not really talking today about how to fix them. We could do that in a future podcast. But it's really important to go about it in an organized way and really identify them well. So one way that you can determine if psychosocial hazards are present at your facility is by doing a task analysis. And we actually have a task analysis that we teach in our Taproot courses. It's called CHAP, Critical Human Action Profile. And the reason this works is you go out and you actually observe the work being done, the work process being done. So then you can identify, are there issues in the environment that is causing this worker stress? Is there something that we can minimize there? We're not just looking for physical hazards, but psychosocial hazards as well. How are the team members working together on this task? Are there any frictions there? Does the worker seem like they know what their role is as they are working through this task? Do they feel like they have input on this task? Are they having to run and get permission every time they take a next step? These are things that you can really determine from a task analysis, and using something like the Taproot CHAP, which is our system of task analysis. But that's one way to do it, and that's something that we teach in our 5-day root cause analysis class. We also teach it in our evidence collection class, how to perform a CHAP. Another way that we can figure out if psychosocial hazards are present is ask the worker. Ask them.
There you go.
Have them sit down and ask. And the root cause tree can be so beneficial in collecting information on that. We teach it in our evidence collection course, how to use the root cause tree to ask thoughtful questions to get the best information. And it works as well for identifying psychosocial hazards, because there are 15 questions on the front of the root cause tree, and these questions are developed by human factors experts. So you don't have to be a human factors expert to know the questions to ask. And not only are there 15 questions on the root cause tree, but the root cause tree dictionary, which we always use together. There are so many more questions that you can think about if you're thinking about asking the workers, questions around our psychosocial hazards present.
And you mentioned too about industry, and each workforce is different. Some may need to do those checks and balances, with every little thing that they do. That might be part of the industry that they're in, and that there's no other way around it. But we've talked before about permission to send an email. That might be a little much.
Right.
So identifying those hazards is a great place to start before we start trying to fix everything. It's a very good point.
And we work together on the evidence collection course on the pre-summit every year. And we know that planning, it takes some time to plan an investigation, to plan evidence collection. So you do want to spend some time and not rushing into just assuming. You really want to have evidence-based, you want evidence that these psychosocial hazards are present. You just don't want to assume that they are. So unless you're really asking the worker or performing a task analysis and seeing that for yourself, you're making assumptions, and we really don't want to do that.
And so the point with getting with HR, that might just kind of thinking out loud, task analysis, getting if it's a safety supervisor and HR, and let's just observe. Let's see how this task is being performed, and then noticing well, why do you have to keep going all the way to the other end of the dock to get your propane?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, because second shift keeps taking my propane. I don't have any. I have to go all the way over there to get it. Well, wait a minute. Then you start to realize there's a lot of other things within the system, and the
causing stress.
Yes,
Yeah.
root cause free. Then you start to see, well, I'd be frustrated too. So I think that's excellent to do the task analysis, partner up with HR if you're a safety professional, and work together in tandem and find out the ways that work can be more productive and ultimately safer for everybody.
Asking for input is so important. On the root cause tree, under management system, we have employee communications need improvement and employee feedback needs improvement, and that's all about the two-way street. Like, is the message coming down from management? Are people getting the message, and are the employees' concerns, are they getting up the ladder to the managers too? So reviewing the root cause tree can help you come up with a lot of questions around what psychosocial hazards might be present. There's a couple other ways too. We mentioned in another video that we did, and that is writing good job descriptions. Now, see, this is where the safety professionals and HR can work together too, because HR, that's their thing, right? Getting the job descriptions written. And a lot of times we think of a job description, well, I don't want to write a job description because then my worker might say, well, this is not my job, it's not on my job description, right? But you can't really think of it that way, because it really helps to mitigate the psychosocial hazard of people not feeling they have control over their job or their role clarity if they have actually written what the core of their job really is. So job descriptions can really mitigate psychosocial hazards, and that is just another, as I said, example of how HR and safety professionals can work together to do that. And then finally, one thing that we really strongly recommend in Taproot, and we actually have a book about it, and that's audits. We got a book about how to do an audit in Taproot. We have a pre-summit course on how to do audits, but that's one way that you can identify psychosocial hazards, and we really encourage that in our root cause analysis classes, because again, we want to be spending our time on the things that matter. We just don't want to be grabbing something out of the air. Is this something that's really present? Is this something that we really need to be looking at? So doing an audit in Taproot, if you are Taproot trained to do an investigation, it is really not hard to learn how to do a Taproot audit. It is essentially the same process, but you're looking for, instead of you're looking for causal factors, you're looking for significant issues that might happen. So it's auditing using Taproot is very easy to learn. You can buy the book, you can go to the pre-summit course, or you can go to our 5-day course, and we teach auditing there. So those are the 4 ways that you can really kind of identify your hazards that are present, and that is by task analysis, asking the worker, writing job descriptions, and doing audits.
That is so valuable. Thank you, Barb.
Welcome.
And you write a lot. I'm editorial director, so you write a lot, and a lot of this you can find on our blog at taproot.com/blog. Easy enough. There's actually a built-in search, so you can type into the box. It's the first little box you see on the left, psychosocial, and see anything that Barb's written that's published out there about psychosocial hazards, which is a great asset to have. And then just read all the other things we have on our blog as well. But it's a good resource with more of the information. And then, like we said, we'll be doing more of these, so we encourage you to subscribe to our channels. We're on all the different socials that are out there, so be sure to follow us. The goal is to have these types of video podcasts weekly, and there's all kinds of topics that we'll be just navigating through in the safety realm. So thanks for chatting with me today, Barb, and we will see you guys next time.